Well, Katie, thank you so much for joining the podcast. I'm incredibly excited to have you joining for this really important topic in low energy availability. And welcome, and I'd love if you can introduce yourself and just give the audience a bit of a background.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you so much for inviting me and reaching out. As you'll soon learn, I love talking about this topic, and it's a real big passion of mine. I guess for your listeners, I am in New Zealand, and I grew up in New Zealand. Grew up down the bottom of the South Island, but where I am currently now is in the Waikato and around Hamilton area, Cambridge area, and immersed around a whole bunch of elite athletes, which is really exciting. Um, I've always had a passion for food and sport. I guess whenever I look, as I was growing up, always involved in sport, always heavily involved with food, making food, always hungry, that type of thing. So it was just natural that when I finished high school that I embarked on undergraduate degrees in nutrition and then a separate degree in physical education. And I guess through my studies there, that's when I really got interested in asking a lot of questions and wanting to figure out answers, and that led me down the research path. So did my master's there. Um, I guess all throughout my university, that's when I was heavily involved in sport, and that's where my background in track cycling kicked off. So I would say I'm an ex-elite track cyclist and was fortunate enough to be a part of the New Zealand cycling program professionally for 4 years before retiring in 2016. And it was through my experiences of elite sport that's when I experienced low energy availability, and kind of working my way through that, finding a few questions that were still unanswered, re-sparked that research kind of mentality. And that's where I then went to finish my PhD in specifically low energy availability. So yeah, I guess finishing that last year, and I'm now have my own private practice, nutrition based, helping athletes. Majority of them are female athletes, just to help prevent them from going into low energy availability and just to help support their health and their performance.
Mm.
Mm.
So maybe just from the outset, let's explore what are we meaning when we talk about
Perfect.
low energy availability and some of the terminology as it's evolved.
Yeah, sure. So a lot of people might be familiar with the term female athlete triad. That's been around for a very long time, and that's what I grew up learning about. And what that is this interaction between disordered eating. Um, you have your disordered eating, you have menstrual dysfunction, and then you have issues with bone health. So if you had one or three of that criteria, you're deemed to be part of this female athlete triad. Um, but then over time, this has grown, and researchers and medical professionals have found that there's actually some other body systems that can be impacted. And this is where this term relative energy deficiency in sport, or RED-S, has come into play. So it doesn't necessarily move away from the triad, but it expands the triad and incorporates the triad. Um, I guess what we should define RED-S is, I look at it as an umbrella term that impacts a whole lot of body systems through having low energy availability. So when we want to describe low energy availability, what I like to liken it to is like your cell phone. So your cell phone, it might run on low battery, and when you have your cell phone at low battery, it might start to dim the screen, or you might decide to turn off a few apps. That's essentially what the body is going to be doing when you're having low energy availability. And we get into states of low energy availability when we're not having enough food on board, or we're exercising way too much for what we are fueling our bodies with. And that's where we get these complications with certain body systems. And we can talk about that in a little bit. But what I like about the RED-S model is that it expands to include males, because we know males can suffer from underfueling, and it also has a good component where our psychological function can be impacted with underfueling, low energy availability. Yeah. Does that help clear things up?
Yeah, that's great. I have not come across that analogy before with a mobile phone or cell phone, and I think that's very insightful and will give people a really helpful, almost tangible concept of what low energy availability actually is and is doing for them.
Yeah, so I mean, we might naturally be in states of low energy availability through the week, and we can bounce out of that. It's more the chronic states of low energy availability, which will then lead into having the RED-S syndrome.
Yeah.
So I guess it's like when, say, you start training for a half marathon and your training ramps up in terms of volume or intensity, but then you're not actually matching that with an increase in caloric intake, then over time, if you're training for 3 months plus and you're underfueling, not putting enough food in the tank, that's when you start to get chronic low energy availability and then potentially have RED-S syndrome.
Mm. And it's energy from a almost umbrella perspective. So we're not talking that you necessarily need, it's not carbohydrate specific or protein specific. It's the umbrella of energy calories generally.
Yeah. I guess research hasn't really nailed down, the differences between fueling, with a certain percentage of carbohydrate versus a certain percentage of fat or protein. What we're finding is, I think, if you're just having, enough calories, given that it's from a well-balanced proportion of micronutrients, then you're fine. I'm really curious to know, like, if someone is in low energy availability, if we increase their carbohydrate, is that going to improve their, metabolic function, their hormone function? Because we know carbohydrate is tightly linked to estrogen, and we know we need estrogen for menstrual cycles. So these ideas float away in my mind, and there's still a few questions that are unanswered.
It's the next PhD.
Yeah, I know, right?
So when man or woman comes to you with low energy availability, or you suspect that they just present, they've lost their mojo or they've lost something, what are they saying to you?
Yeah, so key indicators for me are mood. If they're unmotivated, kind of going, oh, like training is just so hard. The main thing is my performance is just going downhill and going downhill fast. They tell me they're eating well, they're telling me they're training more and nothing's happening. So there is a slight imbalance there. So one is performance plateau or performance decrease. The other one is, Katie, I'm just not recovering like I used to between my sessions. And it might be between sessions or even within a session if they're doing a training block or training session and they've got repeated efforts. They'll find they're good for the first two, and then the last three are terrible. They just can't get to where they were for those first 2 reps. And for me, that's just a fueling issue. They're just not having enough fuel on board, and we might look at what they're eating and training, and it might be nothing. Because on top of all that, and this is what we have to be really mindful of when dealing with clients, is majority of them will exercise because they're wanting to lose weight. And it's really counterintuitive to be told, if you want to lose weight, you actually need to eat a little bit more. And you need to fuel your sessions right so that you can get the most out of your exercise or your training, no matter what you're doing. So that's more on the performance piece, but then I get a lot of people who come to me with gut function issues. So they might have a lot of bloating, they might be having constipation or diarrhea or a mix of both throughout the week. One is not having a menstrual cycle, and that's a really big indicator for females if they are feeling well. Now, obviously, that is if they're naturally menstruating and they're not on any hormonal contraceptive, or they're not in the stage of perimenopause or postmenopause. For the men, it's usually low mood. You can look at morning erections, like how many morning erections are they having, and that could be indicative of low testosterone. But just depends on how close you are with your client if you want to ask those questions. And also if they're getting repeated injuries, it's a big one, like bone stress injuries. If they are frequent or they're not healing as well as you'd think, then maybe that is a fueling issue. I will say though, some of these symptoms can be linked to more of a medical condition. So I always refer my athletes to go make sure GP's checking over, there's no thyroid issue and stuff like that. So it's important, if they all come back normal, then it possibly is a fueling issue, and just looking at the nutrition, making sure their main meals are well balanced and their training nutrition is optimal.
So you skated over it just very briefly, but perhaps you could just unpack a little bit why we need to flip the switch in regards to how we think about needing to eat more to lose weight rather than eat less to lose weight.
Yeah, I see this a lot in some of my clients, where they might be in their 40s plus, kind of in the perimenopause stage of having an increase in body fat and wanting to lose that. So they come to me usually wanting to improve their health and their energy, but there is an underlying tone of, I just want to move kind of like the muffin top around me. And I'm like, that's great. Like, if we focus on your exercise habits and your eating habits, I'm sure that can be improved. And what I find is they're in such a state of high stress because they're not eating. And when we don't eat, that's when our cortisol level goes up. It's when we're in a high stress environment and the body's just going, I'm not getting enough food on board, so I'm going to hold on to all my resources. And that is typically our fat mass. So when a client comes to me and they're like, I'm not eating, I'm exercising a lot, I just look at that as the body's just going alert, alert, alert. We're too stressed, so we're gonna hold on to all these stores of fat. So it's not until you start fueling the body in the right way that the body can relax and go, okay, I can actually use what I have and use that for our energy, use that for my training. And we usually find, within 4 to 6 months, that weight just kind of naturally comes off. Yeah.
Interesting. I think it's a battle for people to get
totally
around that, and especially that we've been told for so many decades really that calorie deficit is the only way to lose weight.
Yeah, I was just about to say we're in this diet culture of exercise more, eat less. And that's just stemmed from the population that we're getting more obese, more overweight. But that doesn't mean that for the general population who doesn't fall into that category, that rule applies.
Mm,
It is a really hard thing to get away from when also social media, it's everywhere. And, the messages, the images you see all relate to, depending on who you follow, of course, but, you know, relate to that diet culture.
mm, yeah. So I did want to ask you about. I think this is something that's associated with low energy, but we don't often connect the two, and that's around orthorexia
Mm.
and how that can be a trigger for low energy availability. Can you perhaps expand on what orthorexia is and yeah, just how LEA would tie in with that?
Yeah, it's a really good point. And another thing, social media is kind of going in this eat clean, eat healthy, stuff like that. So if we should really define what orthorexia is. And definition there refers to an unhealthy obsession with eating pure food, and food considered pure or impure can vary from person to person. So that's where it kind of makes it a little bit tricky.
Mm,
Um, and it is classified, well, closely classified as an eating disorder. Um, and it's involved around their behavior of being healthy or clean and using nutrition in that case. And it might be just to cope with having control or something along those lines. Um, so if we look at if someone is eating clean, and like I said before, it depends on the person and what they deem is clean, but mostly it is having fruits and vegetables, may or may not have meats, but avoiding processed foods, avoiding sugar, may reduce like a macronutrient, like may deem carbohydrates as a bad or unpure food. So that's when we start to see high risk of having low energy availability, especially if they're omitting a food group and not replacing it with something else. Yes, clean eating has an abundance of vitamins and minerals if they're having lots of fruit and vegetables, but typically those, if they're eliminating the carbohydrate or that complex carbohydrate type foods, we have low energy density in our foods, right? Lettuce is full of water. It's got no nutrient density, energy density to it. And on top of that, if we look at some people with orthorexia might eliminate fats because that might be deemed bad.
mm,
So that is another high energy, high density type food. So orthorexia can easily fall into low energy availability
mm,
because they are limiting quality foods like nuts and seeds because they might deem that as high fat food, high caloric food, that's not needed for my body, so I'm going to take it out.
And I think there's a couple of things that come to mind that people often start in a really it's a good place. Like they start with good intentions
Mm,
to clean eat, and they want to clean up their diet, and that can be a positive thing. But then there's a transition at some point where that becomes, would you say, almost an obsession? Is that the defining point where it changes from good intentions to something more that unhealthy for someone.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we all might start, I'm gonna, improve my eating, and I'm gonna have more fruit and vegetables. And then it can get to the point where you start to feel really good, and then it might be, right, what else can I do to improve my diet? And then it gets down to being quite controlled and specific on what you can and can't have, and that becomes very restrictive and limiting. I think if it gets to the point where you have anxiety or you feel guilty for the food that you're eating that you are deeming unhealthy, then I think that's when you need to take a step back and go, this is going too far. And that's when, I would definitely be pushing clients to go seek someone to talk about that, because then you're only doing yourself a disservice to your health, really. Like, health is foremost for anyone that I see, and for longevity purposes. And we know with underfueling, the impacts on the body can be quite dramatic. One being osteoporosis, brittle bones. If we're not fueling our bodies and we're not getting the hormones that we need to make bone cells and rebuild up bone, then we're going to be at high risk of having brittle bones when we're, at the age of 60, 70, when we still have, years and years of life left in us. Yeah.
And I think to point out too that that it's not uncommon. It's not common, but it's not ever not seen. That's a way of phrasing it, for people with low energy availability to actually develop osteoporosis in their 30s, 40s, where it's been a prolonged issue. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I definitely have known of athletes who have low bone mineral density, and they're in their 30s, and they have to be really careful of what activities they do. And it's, talking to them, like, it's not a nice place to be, and I guess that happens when you're in your younger years, and making sure that in your teenage years you are fueling enough. It can be tricky when you have a really talented athlete that's doing all the work and all the training, and might have some pressures either by the environment they're in or a coach, that puts particular what do you call it, beliefs into that person, and that can be really damaging for their health. So there's a huge education piece that's needed for everyone, to how do we fuel well, and for our health mainly, and then for our sport.
Yeah. And do you work much with teens and see it as being much of an issue in teens coming through? As a mum of 3 kids who are involved in various activities, I don't see it with my own kids because I'm always onto them, but I see it with their friends, and I think I call it a sleeping giant. That I think we're yet to wake, and that's with across all ages who are active. But do you see it particularly in teens as well?
Yeah, I hate to say yes, and I do like your wording of a sleeping giant, and it's kind of almost taboo, if you see this happening in a group of girls, like, what do you do? Who do you talk to? How do you go about addressing it? And that's a really challenging conversation to have, one with the teenager, and two, potentially with their parents, because the teenagers know what they're doing. They're not idiots. And recently I've come across, a group of teenagers, and it's almost turned into like a cult. you know, you should not be seen having lunch, and you need to fit into these particular clothes, that type of thing. So it's a massive cultural piece. And how do you break that cycle? I don't have the answers for that, but it's comes down to education and catching them young, and helping them see how important food and nutrition is for their body's development, their health, how they function at school, like their concentration, their grades. And then there is the piece on how parents can help, how coaches can help, how other people who are around them can help with that messaging.
Yeah.
And it's a massive task. And I think if you can just help teenagers enjoy food and not see food exercise as kind of cost reward
Yes.
system, like, okay, you went out and did a soccer game with your child, and it's like, the languaging, it shouldn't be, well, you had such a great game, because you had such a great game, let's go get ice cream. It shouldn't be like that. It should just be, let's go grab some food. And if ice cream's part of that, it is part of that, but it shouldn't be doing like, oh, this is a reward. Because that can then flip side as, well, I didn't do well at soccer, so I'm not going to get ice cream.
Yeah.
And that over time can escalate.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it? And that's just even how people parent generally is impacted in that conversation, and then that overflows into how they parent from a supportive perspective with sport. Yeah, so interesting.
Yeah. And it even it is a slight tangent, but it's all related in terms of body image. And if yourself are going through a diet, I mean, I don't like to use the word diet, but say it is a diet to improve body composition, and your teenager or young human sees that you are looking in the mirror and figuring out, I don't like this part, and I'm going on a diet to fix this part. That filters down. So I don't know how you approach that with your clients.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's trying to change the framework in thinking that it's about training for life, not just an event, or eating for life and longevity and health, not just to lose those 5 kilos or whatever. And it's trying to reframe it in your own mind, and in their minds, but it's so ingrained for us to, after we've had kids or whatever, we stand in front of the mirror and say, oh, I don't like my thighs this week or something. And you're right, the kids hear that.
Yeah. So say it internally, but also add a positive to it.
Yeah.
My boobs are looking so good today.
Can you tell me, you've done some really interesting research with male cyclists. I wanted to touch on some of the research you've done there. I love the title of your research, Where Are All the Men? Because I know that I've primarily focused with women, but I think obviously there's women who have men in their lives for whom this might be an issue that they need to raise. But also for men listening, this is not just an issue for women, is it?
No, like I said at the start, men are affected by underfueling, low energy availability as well. It's just not as well researched, which hence the title of that paper you mentioned. And I think that just stems back from, the very beginning when we talked about the female athlete triad. They've now come out with the male athlete triad. So I guess a lot of research has been done on the females because of the impact to the menstrual cycle. Obviously, with males, they don't have that as an equivalent for ease of research, but we could look at testosterone, for example. So I guess going back to the research, what I was really interested in is just looking at, okay, can they be affected by low energy availability, and what are the consequences? So I just did a review of all the literature. I narrowed it down to cycling only, just to keep it a little bit nicer, and that was the direction of my research anyway. And looking at the impact of low energy availability or energy deficiency in male cyclists. And so throughout all the research that I found, some of the key findings was that male cyclists do underfuel, and it does happen in training and it does happen in competition. But there are some consequences of underfueling, and that is having down regulation of your endocrine function. So you're looking at lowered testosterone, increased cortisol. So similar to the females, which I mentioned before, if we're in an energy deficit, we're starving ourselves, it's a stress response. So then we have a spike in cortisol. With cycling research, we're always really interested in bone density because we don't get that impact that can help maintain bone density if you were comparing that to, say, a runner. So it's a really good indicator of fueling as well. So with the whole bunch of studies across the board, you'd see lowered rates of bone density, particularly in the spine. And in terms of performance, they had lower power output. So they're not able to produce as much power or go as fast as those that were fueling. And then there was a study done that looked at abnormal eating behaviors and their depression scores, and they were correlated. So that does show that, if we have some sort of energy deficiency, there is a link to mood, and higher rates of depression when we're not eating enough.
Yeah, and you alluded to that before, that it's one of your first trigger signs for when people hear you, is that sense of I'm just feeling flat and lost my motivation for what I'm doing. Yeah. Can I ask you just to cycle back a little bit, I guess, for as far as women go with the menstrual cycle, that maybe there is just a concept, a thought process that if you don't have your period, that we can just put you on the pill and that will be okay, you're good to go after that. Can you talk a little bit around that and why that may or may not be the best option to start with, but also a bit of a cover up?
Yeah, sure. So it's kind of like my gripe, when I see that happen. So I get it quite frequently, although it is changing now, where an athlete might have no cycle, or they'll have an irregular cycle, and then they get put on an OCP, oral contraceptive pill, to regulate their hormones and to get their cycle back. Now, what's happening when an individual starts taking this pill or the medication is it is providing your body a false sense of what's going on. So it's masking actually what your body is naturally wanting to do. So it's giving you a fake cycle. It's not an actual physiological period. It's just a response to not taking any of the pills when you have the sugar pills or the non-active pills. So we call that a pill bleed. It's not a menstrual bleed. So that's really covering up the underlying issue, or it's covering up what is going or is not going on, I should say, and masking your natural cycle, or you're not even having a cycle. And the impact of that is, like, we can use our menstrual cycle as kind of like a tracking mechanism to see if you are fueling well or not. We lose that because you'll get it automatically if you take the pill. And so that's when it kind of is, you're down one of your diagnostic tools if you want to use that. So if an athlete starts having an irregular cycle or no cycle, then you really want to get to the underlying cause of that before you start using medication. Now, I will say medication can be useful for those that are heavy menstrual bleeders, and that all has to come under the medical advice. But there are uses for oral contraception. Obviously, contraception is the big one, but they might be used for other things. And I do find that athletes just want to be on the pill so that they know when they're going to have a cycle, and then they can skip it if they're competing or racing. So that's a conversation to have, with them and the medical doctor.
Yeah, okay.
Does that help or not?
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah. Where do you see us going next in the future with research, or what do you think needs to happen next?
For me, I'm a big driver of education, and I think we're doing well at educating what is low energy availability, what is Red S, what to look out for. But then I guess the next step is, how do we engage those athletes who need to fuel more, who are resistant to fueling more? Like, how do we break that cycle? So that's kind of one thing that I'm keen to get into and to discover and figure out, how can we get these athletes back on board so that they are healthy and then that they can perform. I think also that we need to look at, say, an athlete has Red S and they've been in it for a year, they've lost their menstrual cycle for a year. What can we do to get their menstrual cycle back, and what is the time frames? Because a lot of athletes want to know, right, well, if I'm fueling X amount of calories more, or if I have, an extra meal a day, how long do I have to do that before I get better? And we don't know these answers, and everyone is different. And I see that in my own practice. One will just, have, an extra snack a day. One has to have 2 meals a day extra to get their menstrual cycle back. And one might get it back within a month, and another might get it back in a year or more. So there are lots of other questions, obviously, that relate to that, in terms of how long were they in low energy availability, how big was the deficit of energy intake before they started losing or having body impairments. So yeah, LEA is so complex, and there's lots of moving parts. So I don't think there's going to be a black and white answer, but hopefully we could provide athletes with guidelines. If you follow this particular protocol, then you should regain function in XYZ. Yeah.
Because do you think one of the obstacles is, it's not just the food intake, it's reducing the training program for a season as well? And do you see an acceptance that needs to happen alongside improving energy intake generally?
Yeah, you bring up a really good point. Originally, the guidelines or protocol was eat more, train less. And for an athlete, training is, for some, that's their life, and that's their life. What am I trying to say? That's what gets them up in the morning.
Yeah.
You know, and if you eliminate that, that's giving them psychological stress, and is that doing more harm? So with most of the athletes I work with, we have we monitor their trainings. We might reduce their intensity, but still keep in the volume, as long as they are improving their nutrition.
Okay.
If we're finding that recovery is not well, their recovery metrics are down, then we do a stepwise reduction in training. But we're also really working a lot with a psychologist or a mental skills or someone along the side there, because this was also part of my research. There's such a psychological component to this condition, and I feel it's more of the behavior change that's needed and the understanding that's needed than the actual putting things into practice.
Yeah. So if someone is listening to this and they reflect on the conversation and can identify perhaps in themselves that maybe LEA is a risk for them or possibly a child, what do you suggest are the next steps for someone?
So I would say talk to a nutritionist or a dietitian. If they're involved in sport, then go more towards a sports dietitian or nutritionist, just to make sure that they are fueling for what they're doing, and exercise being sports trainings and stuff like that. Obviously, if there's a lot of fatigue, injury, weight loss, weight gain, then that's maybe go to your GP, get some bloods done, make sure you don't have low iron, check thyroid function and all of that, just to make sure there's no underlying conditions. And it's probably just a communication piece. You know, how do you feel about your training? How is it going? Talking to the coaches, are they seeing anything? Like, are they drinking enough in training? Are they eating? Does the coach allow breaks for eating and fluid intake? Some coaches don't, and that's a conversation to have with either the school or the coach or the club. Those would be my main things, and just opening up the communication of, you know, how are you feeling? Are you feeling good today? How have you found the last week? Especially for females and young females, if they've reached the age of 15 and they haven't had their first period, then that's go to the GP just to check that. And if they haven't had a natural cycle within 3 months or more, also go to the GP and just check that. Otherwise, it ends up being a fueling issue. And if there is a fueling issue, then it's a case of, why are we not eating? Are we just not prepared? Do we just not know how much we need to eat? And that's when a nutritionist will be really helpful. Or is it, not prepared? Like, we see it, we are so busy, right? We get the kids ready, get them off to school, and then before you know it, you've got to get to work, and you've had a cup of coffee and that's it. But really, we need to be the ones that are role models, and we need to be having good breakfast, good lunch, good dinner, and making sure that when we are exercising, we are also looking after ourselves with having snacks here and there for that.
Yeah. There's so much I want to ask you about, and I think that'll be podcast too. I've tried to keep it quite micro-focused today on LEA, but I think, you know, there's so much around the fueling before and after, and what should women be having with regards to protein and carbohydrate. But that's definitely the topic of another podcast. But Where can people find you, Katie, as we wrap this up?
Sure. I'm mostly on Instagram, so that's at athletenutrition.katie. Oh, sorry, athlete.nutrition.katie. Or my website www.katie-schofield.com. Do you want me to spell that out, or
That's
you
all
put
right.
it?
I'll put a link so that
Okay.
people have it there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And happy anyone to reach out, DM or whatever, if you have any questions. Yeah, for sure, reach out.
And
Happy to help.
you're in New Zealand, do you do telehealth consults too?
Yeah, I do online consults for sure.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, thank you. Is there anything you feel that is burning within you to add before we finish?
Um, oh, it's probably just more overall in terms of language and education. It's when you're talking to an individual and they might be, I don't know, maybe they're not eating enough. It's like, okay, we need to fuel for our health, we need to fuel for our exercise, we need to fuel for our performance, and all that fueling is going to be able to give that individual the robustness to get through anything, whether it's training or throughout the day, and that they'll be adaptable. And I think those are two really important things for an individual to be robust and adaptable. So, and that's going to give them the fueling for longevity. We all want to live longer and be healthier while we age. So that's probably my final say.
Amazing. We'll leave it there. Great place to finish. Thank you so much.
Guys, thanks so much for having me.